The column had been moving slowly for hours, feeling its way through the fractured outskirts east of Aachen, when a sudden crackle of rifle fire forced the men to the ground. It ended as quickly as it began, one final echo rolling across the broken farmhouses, then nothing. When the dust settled, the GIs rose cautiously, brushing brick powder from their jackets as the silence reclaimed the road. It was then, through the drifting haze, that they saw the shape blocking their advance. Not another barricade, but a machine, massive, motionless, and utterly out of place in the stillness that followed violence. At first, it seemed like a wreck left behind in the retreat, but as they approached, its size became unmistakable. Nearly 8 tons of steel rested on the torn pavement, its long tracks pressed deep into the mud, its great front wheels frozen as though caught mid-stride. The men recognized the silhouette from briefing photographs. A German heavy half-track, the kind that usually stayed far behind enemy lines. But this one had been left intact, abandoned as though its crew had vanished between breaths. A faint, rhythmic ticking rose from beneath the hood, the sound of a hot engine surrendering its heat to the cold October air. It suggested a truth none of the soldiers ignored. Someone had been here moments earlier. The armored grille still shimmered with warmth, hinting at haste, at fear, or perhaps at an order too urgent to question. Whatever the reason, the Sd.Kfz 7 stood before them like a relic pried from Germany's industrial ambition. The Americans circled it slowly, their boots crunching on shattered stone. Some saw opportunity in its strength, others danger in its unfamiliar machinery. But war left little room for wonder. A sergeant stepped forward, resting a hand on the side armor, and instructed his men to test the vehicle. If it ran, it could pull what their own trucks could not. Pragmatism in these final months had become a quiet form of survival. None of them yet grasped the machine's true appetite, or the deeper story it carried about a nation straining under the weight of its own designs. And on that ruined road to Aachen, the lesson waited to unfold. The mechanic approached the engine compartment with a deliberate calm, his hands darkened by weeks of field repairs and hurried triage on vehicles barely holding together. He lifted the side panel and studied the unfamiliar arrangement of cables, filters, and manifolds. German engineering, he knew, prized precision, and this Maybach HL62 was no exception. With cautious movements, he primed the fuel system, listening to the subtle clicks that signaled readiness. Around him, the other soldiers waited in a circle of expectant silence, as though witnessing a relic being awakened. He pressed the starter. The first response was a hesitant cough, a sputter that rattled through the frame like a question. Then, with a surge that felt almost alive, the inline-six caught flame. A deep, resonant growl rolled out from beneath the armored hood, an unmistakable voice of power. The men stepped back instinctively, startled by the sudden force vibrating through the air. This was no worn-out farm truck or battlefield improvisation. It was a machine built to haul Germany's heaviest artillery across continents, and its awakening felt like the return of something once feared. As the mechanic settled into the driver's seat, dust rose from the roadside in gentle spirals, drawn into motion by the half-track's steady rumble. He eased the throttle forward. The vehicle responded with surprising grace, its tracks gripping the broken pavement while its front wheels searched for direction. It moved with an odd elegance, half-tractor, half-armored carrier, yet unmistakably confident in its purpose. The GIs watched it roll a few meters down the road, then back again, each pass erasing a little more of their caution. A cheer rose from the group, not loud but satisfied. In a war measured by losses, any gain felt larger than it appeared. This abandoned machine, once a symbol of German strength, now answered to American hands. The radio operator keyed his microphone and sent the message up the line. "We've got German wheels and they run." It was a simple report, stripped of emotion, yet carrying a quiet triumph. None of the men paused to consider why the crew had abandoned a functioning half-track, or what it demanded in fuel, maintenance, and attention. They saw only its promise, not its price. And as they turned the vehicle toward their own lines, they unknowingly carried with them the first hint of a burden still concealed beneath its steel skin, one that would reveal itself in the miles ahead. The half-track made its way down the narrow road with a confidence that surprised even the men riding in it. As they passed a company of American infantry resting beside a shattered wall, heads turned in disbelief. Laughter rose from the group, light, momentary, the kind that surfaces in war. And something breaks the monotony of danger. To see Americans seated proudly in German steel felt like a small reversal of fortune, a quiet victory carved out of the chaos. Along the roadside, villagers emerged from doorways and cellars, their expressions cautious and clouded by fatigue. Others paused mid-task, unsure of what they were witnessing. The insignia on the soldiers' uniforms signaled liberation, yet the machine they rode signaled something older, something that had once rumbled through these same streets with the authority of occupation. In their silence lay a simple question: who, at this moment in the fading year of 1944, truly held control? The Sd.Kfz-7 climbed the next rise with effortless strength, its broad tracks biting into the mud where American trucks had earlier churned helplessly. The hill that had delayed convoys for hours offered no resistance to the German vehicle. The driver felt its torque through the steering column, a steady power that seemed almost indifferent to terrain. The half-track did not strain, did not hesitate. It simply advanced. Inside the cabin, appreciation replaced caution. The mechanic who had coaxed the engine back to life leaned forward as if listening to a well-tuned argument. The smoothness of the transmission, the stability of the chassis, each detail hinted at a philosophy of engineering that sought precision even when resources were thin. For a brief moment, the borders of allegiance faded. Machines, after all, served physics before they served nations. "This thing could pull a house," one GI muttered, half amused, half admiring. The others nodded, letting the joke settle into the rhythm of the ride. The half-track felt like a gift taken from the enemy with little effort, almost too easily claimed. But beneath its polished performance lay demands no one had yet accounted for. And as the road stretched ahead, those demands waited patiently to surface. To understand the half-track now rumbling toward American lines, the narrative must step back more than a decade, to a Germany reshaping itself in the shadow of lost empire. Industry was awakening from the constraints of the interwar years, and engineers were again free to imagine machines that could restore the nation's military stature. In workshops across Munich and Brunswick, the early outlines of a new doctrine emerged, one that prized mechanical excellence above all else, even when resources warned of limits. It was within this climate of ambition that the foundations of the Sd.Kfz-7 were laid. At Crossmafe, designers experimented with hybrid solutions that combined the traction of tracks with the steering precision of wheels. Their goal was not modest. The Wehrmacht wanted a tractor capable of hauling the 88 gun, a weapon whose weight exceeded 7 tons and whose battlefield role demanded rapid repositioning. Engineers at Busing NAG joined the effort, refining prototypes that pushed beyond conventional boundaries. They envisioned a vehicle that would not merely support artillery, but elevate it, carrying the gun across terrain that would immobilize lesser machines. In their drafts and calculations, the half-track became a statement of intent. The military's demands encouraged this ambition. Officers desired speed for mobile warfare, power for heavy ordnance, and presence for a force aspiring to modernity. The vehicle was expected to reflect the confidence of a nation rebuilding its martial identity. The Sd.Kfz-7 was therefore shaped not only by technical decisions, but by the cultural expectations of its era. It was designed to be seen, to project capability, and to signal that Germany had rejoined the industrial great powers. The result was a machine that carried the unmistakable signature of unrestrained engineering. Its Maybach HL62 engine was larger than necessary, its chassis stronger than most missions required. The suspension system, intricate, multi-jointed, and labor-intensive, delivered smoothness unmatched by Allied tractors, but demanded precision manufacturing the nation would later struggle to sustain. Everything about the vehicle was more than functional, it was aspirational. Oversized, overbuilt, overcomplicated, it embodied the belief that superior craftsmanship could overcome strategic and material disadvantages. Germany invested heavily in such ideals, trusting that mastery of machinery would translate into mastery of the battlefield. Even as shortages loomed and production lines strained, the principle remained intact: excellence before efficiency, perfection before practicality. In peaceful years, this philosophy produced marvels. In total war, it became a burden the country could no longer carry. The Sd.Kfz-7 therefore reflected more than engineering choices. It reflected a national conviction that quality alone could shape destiny. Admirable in concept, it promised much and consumed more. And as the Americans pushed their captured prize westward, they were unknowingly in harry. Ting not only its strengths, but also the consequences of the ideal from which it was forged. In the early years of the war, the Sd.Kfz-7 appeared everywhere the German camera lens turned. Newsreels captured it cresting dunes in North Africa, its tracks carving deliberate lines through the desert as the sun glinted off the barrels of the 88 guns behind it. Audiences in Berlin watched these images with a mixture of pride and reassurance. Here was a machine that seemed capable of towing victory across continents, its silhouette framed against horizons that once lay beyond Germany's reach. Each reel transformed the half-track into a symbol of momentum, suggesting that the war itself was a mechanical process, precise, unstoppable, and under control. On the Eastern Front, the imagery continued. Footage showed the half-track grinding through snowfields, its engine unfazed by temperatures that froze lesser vehicles solid. Cameramen lingered on its long column of wheels and interleaved tracks, presenting its motion as a kind of industrial rhythm. The message was unmistakable. German mobility remained unbroken despite the scale of the campaign. To the public, the Sd.Kfz. 7 became evidence of technical superiority, a machine that carried the ambition of a nation into territory once deemed unreachable. Commanders added their own praise. Reports spoke of the vehicle's reliability under strain, its ability to tow the heavy 88 gun at speeds unimaginable for previous generations of artillery tractors. Its broad tracks distributed weight evenly, reducing ground pressure and allowing it to traverse mud that swallowed conventional trucks to their axles. In an army that valued operational tempo, the half-track became an indispensable companion to its most famous weapon. Many officers regarded it not merely as equipment, but as a strategic enabler, a mechanical force multiplier. Among the soldiers, admiration took a more personal form. Crews appreciated the power that surged through the Maybach engine, the relative comfort of the seating, and the machine's capacity to carry a full complement of gunners along with ammunition. On long marches, its steadiness offered relief from the jarring motion of lighter vehicles. To sit within its frame was to feel connected to something both engineered and assured, a tool built to sustain advance rather than merely survive it. In their conversations, the half-track was spoken of with a respect usually reserved for weapons, not transports. Through propaganda and genuine experience, the Sd.Kfz. 7 grew into an icon of an army confident that technology could compensate for inferior numbers. It suggested precision where the battlefield delivered uncertainty and strength where logistics delivered strain. Yet the public never saw the hidden costs of this complexity. The labor required to build it, the fuel required to feed it, and the maintenance required to sustain it were burdens carried far from the cameras that framed its triumphs. The machine embodied confidence that seemed unshakable. But in wars of attrition, confidence is measured not in steel but in supply. And as the conflict deepened, the fuel that kept this symbol alive began to thin, revealing a vulnerability the propaganda reels had never shown. While German industry pursued complexity as a form of strength, the United States embraced a different creed, one shaped not by scarcity of manpower or resources, but by an understanding that war on multiple continents demanded machines that could be produced quickly, repaired easily, and supplied without strain. American doctrine began with a simple premise. A vehicle that was good enough and available in thousands was more valuable than one that was exceptional yet rare. In this philosophy, reliability was not merely a technical objective, it was a strategic weapon. The M3 half-track became the clearest embodiment of this mindset. Lighter than its German counterpart and built from straightforward components, it could be manufactured in immense numbers by factories accustomed to civilian production. Steel that once served in commercial trucks was bent, welded, and assembled into a vehicle that carried infantry, towed guns, and performed countless roles on the battlefield. It lacked the refinement of European engineering, but it delivered something the U.S. Army prized far more: predictability. American mechanics noticed immediately the contrast between the M3 and the Sd.Kfz. 7. The M3's flat panels, simplified suspension, and standardized parts made it accessible even to soldiers who had never serviced military machinery before the war. Bolts matched across models. Components could be swapped without hesitation. Armored divisions relied on this consistency not only for mobility, but for tempo, the ability to advance without pausing for repairs that required specialized knowledge or scarce spare parts. Where German craftsmanship sought precision, American design sought momentum. Efficiency SH aped every level of the U.S. vehicle program. Fuel consumption in particular was treated with the same seriousness as ammunition expenditure. Quartermasters calculated gallons per mile, plotted supply routes, and judged operations partly by the burden placed upon convoys of tankers stretching back to ports on distant coasts. A machine that drank too heavily from these reserves risked slowing entire offensives. In this calculus, fuel became a quiet arbiter of strategy. The differences were stark when measured directly. The M3 half-track consumed roughly half the fuel required by the German Sd.Kfz. 7 while performing many of the same battlefield roles. Its lower weight, simpler drivetrain, and modest engine allowed American units to move farther on the same supply, sustaining operations even when logistics were stretched thin. The Germans, by contrast, were increasingly trapped by their own engineering achievements, vehicles that performed magnificently in isolation, but strained the national fuel reserve when fielded en masse. These opposing philosophies, German precision and American pragmatism, rarely confronted one another so directly as they would in the hands of the GIs who had just captured their new prize. They admired the half-track's power, but they had not yet asked the question their own doctrine would have posed immediately. How much does it consume, and can we afford to feed it? That answer waited a few miles down the road, where the German giant would meet the limits of American rations. The half-track had been rolling steadily for less than an hour when the first hint of unease surfaced. The mechanic, still riding shotgun, glanced at the instrument panel out of habit. The fuel needle, which had hovered confidently above the midpoint when they started, now trembled far lower than it should. At first he dismissed it as a quirk of German instrumentation, an unfamiliar gauge responding to the vibration of the road. But as the minutes passed, the needle continued its slow descent, dropping with a rhythm too steady to ignore. By the time they cleared a small copse of trees, concern had replaced curiosity. A corporal riding in the rear leaned over the side railing and tapped the mechanic's shoulder. He had noticed it too. When the driver pulled the vehicle to a halt, the sudden quiet seemed to magnify the tension. The corporal climbed down, walked to the fuel cap, and opened it with a practiced motion. He peered inside, expecting to see reserves still substantial. Instead, he frowned at the faint glint of fuel reflecting at a depth that made little sense. They had barely covered a handful of miles. Something, he realized, was very wrong. The Sd.Kfz 7 carried a fuel tank capable of holding roughly 200 liters, about 53 U.S. gallons. To an American soldier accustomed to the M3 half-track or the ubiquitous 2 a half-ton truck, that number suggested generous range, perhaps enough to last through much of a day's movement. But German vehicles were designed with different assumptions. The Maybach HL62, powerful and refined, demanded a constant supply of fuel to sustain its heavy frame and broad tracks. Even under ideal conditions, its appetite exceeded anything in the American motor pool. And these conditions, muddy roads, steep grades, and the strain of towing equipment not originally meant for it, were far from ideal. The corporal closed the cap and wiped his hands on his jacket, trying to reconcile the figures in his mind. At 1.5 to 2 miles per gallon, the half-track consumed nearly twice what even the thirstiest Sherman tank required on open ground. It was a figure that defied American expectations, shaped by vehicles optimized for efficiency and mass deployment. Here, the GIs confronted a new reality. The machine they had celebrated for its power demanded payment in fuel at a rate they could not easily sustain. The men gathered around the vehicle, the earlier sense of triumph now tempered by calculation. One soldier traced the distance on his map with a gloved finger, measuring the miles to the nearest supply point. Another tried to estimate how long the remaining fuel would last if they reduced speed. The driver remained silent, staring at the gauge as though it might correct itself. Pride, he realized, had carried them this far, but pride would not refill the tank. For the first time since discovering the half-track, the Americans felt the weight of what they had taken. The Sd.Kfz 7 no longer seemed like a prize left by a fleeing enemy. It felt like a testament to a different philosophy, one that valued performance without compromise. Its engineering brilliance was undeniable, but brilliance in war came with obligations, maintenance, spare parts, and above all, fuel. The GIs understood now why the engine had cooled quickly on the roadside where they found it. The German crew had not abandoned it out of panic. They had abandoned it because they had no choice. As the conversation shifted, humor evaporated into logistical concern. The radio man suggested returning the way they had come, in case the nearest American depot lay behind them rather than ahead. The sergeant weighed the idea, knowing that every turn of the tracks consumed precious reserves. In the silence that followed, the half-track clicked softly as its engine settled into rest, the warm metal contracting in the cold afternoon air. It sounded almost alive, an animal with needs far greater than they had anticipated. To move the vehicle forward now required more than admiration. It required calculation, discipline, and resources that did not come easily in the disrupted landscape of Western Germany. The men looked at one another with a shared realization. What they had assumed would be a useful tool had revealed itself as a demanding guest, one whose cost challenged the very efficiency that kept their army advancing. The sergeant finally gave the order to climb back aboard. They would continue, but cautiously. The fuel needle would be watched as closely as the road ahead. And in the quiet rolling of the half-tracks returned to motion, uncertainty accompanied them, an unease that whispered that the machine they had captured might yet consume more than it provided. Ahead, another challenge waited, unseen but inevitable, as the German giant continued its journey on borrowed fuel. The half-track rolled into the American bivouac with the weary rumble of a machine that had already consumed more than its share of the day's resources. Dust clung to its tracks, and the heat rising from the engine hinted at the effort required to move its 8-ton frame across the battered German countryside. When the driver shut it down, the silence that followed seemed almost accusatory. A fuel truck idled nearby, its crew already aware of the request that had been sent ahead by radio. They exchanged glances, half amused, half irritated, before reluctantly maneuvering the tanker alongside the captured vehicle. In a war governed by logistics, every gallon mattered, and here was a machine asking for more than its ration before it had proven anything at all. The hose clattered against the metal as the operator positioned it. The scent of high-octane gasoline carried through the autumn air, sharp and unmistakable. Men gathered as the tank began to fill, watching the numbers rise with the uneasy fascination one might reserve for a bottomless well. The Sd.Kfz. 7 drank without pause. The operator shook his head. "This thing," he muttered, "is going to drain me dry." The complaint carried a note of humor, but beneath it lay the sober arithmetic of supply lines stretching back to the channel ports. Nearby, 2 American mechanics stood with arms folded, studying the Maybach engine with cautious respect. One of them, who had disassembled enough U.S. vehicles to know their internal logic by heart, pointed out the precision-machined components and the intricacy of the cooling system. "Refined," he murmured, "but fragile." He tapped lightly on a housing that would have been cast thicker on an American counterpart. "You break this, you don't fix it in the field." His companion nodded. German engineering, they agreed, was admirable, in the way a fine watch was admirable. But war rarely rewarded delicacy. Rumors began circulating through the camp like dry leaves carried on the wind. Soldiers repeated what they had overheard from the mechanics or invented what they had not. "That thing uses more gas than 3 Jeeps combined," someone said, and no one bothered to challenge the exaggeration. It felt true, and truth in war often traveled on the back of impressions rather than measurements. The half-track's reputation grew with each retelling, powerful, impressive, but insatiable. For the Americans, the realization came slowly but unmistakably. German mobility had not been defeated solely by Allied firepower or overwhelming numbers. It had been undermined by fuel shortages that turned vehicles into liabilities long before they reached the front. In the Sd.Kfz. 7, the GIs saw not only a technological marvel, but also a symptom of a larger failure. Even a machine as capable as this could not outrun the limits of a strained petroleum supply. The Wehrmacht's ambitions had simply outpaced its ability to sustain them. A lieutenant arrived as the refueling continued, the clipboard in his hand already prepared for a problem that had not yet been solved. He listened to the mechanic's brief explanation, then issued an order that surprised no one. The half-track would need strict monitoring. Range logs would be kept. Movement would be restricted. No unnecessary detours, no joyrides, no indulgence in the power that tempted every man who climbed into the driver's seat. The machine would serve only when required, and even then judiciously. The soldiers debated the practicality of this restraint. Some argued that the power was worth the cost, that a vehicle capable of hauling artillery through mud was always an asset. Others countered that the price was too steep, that feeding such a beast in an army built on efficiency defied common sense. The discussion revealed a deeper divide: admiration for engineering on one side, respect for logistics on the other. Both were essential to modern war, but they did not always coexist peacefully. As the last gallons flowed into the tank, the machine seemed to settle. its metallic frame cooling in the late afternoon light. No longer a gleaming trophy, it now appeared as what it truly was, a reminder that performance meant little without supply, and that the greatest engines ever built could be rendered helpless by empty lines in a fuel ledger. The soldiers dispersed, each returning to their duties with a clearer understanding of the war's hidden architecture. The half-track remained, silent for the moment, its presence a quiet lesson in the economics of conflict. And beyond the camp, unseen but inevitable, lay the next test, one that would reveal just how tightly logistics could bind even the strongest of machines. In the days that followed, the Americans found themselves caught between frustration and admiration. The half-track's appetite was undeniable, yet its performance in motion could not be dismissed. When the GIs climbed aboard and the Maybach engine settled into its deep, confident hum, they felt the unmistakable impression of a machine built with intention. Even those most critical of its fuel consumption found their resistance soften once the tracks began to move, and the vehicle revealed, piece by piece, the engineering philosophy that shaped it. Curiosity soon guided their hands. Mechanics and infantrymen alike studied the undercarriage, tracing the arrangement of interleaved wheels that seemed almost excessive by American standards. They examined the dual nature of its design, wheels for steering, tracks for traction, marveling at how seamlessly the two systems worked together. Where the M3 half-track relied on simplicity and rugged components, the Sd.Kfz 7 employed a level of refinement rarely seen on the battlefield. Its suspension absorbed shocks in a way that bordered on elegance, each torsion bar flexing with a precision that suggested more laboratory than frontline. On the road, the difference was unmistakable. The ride, smoother than any American vehicle of comparable size, left the men oddly comfortable as they traversed rutted ground. The half-track glided over terrain that would have jolted them in an M3, its chassis distributing impact with a softness that defied its weight. One soldier described it as riding a machine that thought ahead, and in a sense, he was not wrong. German engineers had crafted a system that anticipated instability and countered it before the occupants could feel it. It was luxury, rendered in steel and oil. Gradually, the Americans began to understand why German crews had spoken of the Sd.Kfz 7 with such pride. For those tasked with towing the formidable 88 gun, it was not merely transport but partner. It cushioned fatigue, stabilized movement, and carried the weight of campaigns with a composure that earned loyalty. As one GI remarked, "If I were hauling an 88 across half of Europe, I'd want this too." The sentiment was shared more widely than anyone admitted aloud. Yet for every strength revealed, another reminder emerged of the machine's limitations in a war of attrition. The same intricacies that produced its effortless ride also required delicate maintenance. The suspension that smoothed the road demanded tools and training few American units carried. And beneath it all, the Maybach engine continued to consume fuel at a rate that no amount of admiration could normalize. Elegance, the men learned, was not free. It carried a price measured in gallons and downtime, in spare parts that could not be scavenged from Allied depots, and in demands that far outstripped battlefield realities. As the GIs worked with the vehicle, this contrast settled into a quiet truth. Beauty in machinery was real, tangible in every welded joint, every well-balanced component, but beauty alone could not shape the outcome of a campaign. Power without practicality became burden, refinement without sustainability became liability. The Germans had built a masterpiece, but masterpieces require conditions that war rarely provides. In the end, respect did not erase caution. The Americans now saw the Sd.Kfz 7 not as a trophy nor as a marvel, but as a lesson embodied in steel, that every advantage carried weight and every innovation demanded payment. On the battlefield, those payments were made in fuel, in time, and sometimes in lives. And ahead of them lay the moment when that cost would no longer be theoretical, when the machine's elegance would collide, unavoidably, with the limits of the road before them. The order arrived just after dawn, carried by a runner whose breath still frosted in the cold November air. American forces outside Aachen needed a cap. Toward 88 gun repositioned to a ridge overlooking a key approach road. Enemy armor had been probing the line, and the high-velocity German weapon, ironically, was now required to blunt a German counterattack. The instructions were clear, but the problem was not. The emplacement lay beyond a steep rise, its approach softened by rain into a slick stretch of mud that clung to boots and swallowed wheels. No American vehicle in the sector could haul a gun of that weight up such ground. The M3 half-track, versatile though it was, simply lacked the power. But one machine did not. Eyes drifted toward the Sd.Kfz. 7 resting beneath a stand of skeletal trees where condensation glistened on the steel-like frost. Its broad tracks and heavy frame suggested strength even at rest. The GIs understood instantly what the order meant. Whatever its appetite, whatever its demands, the German tractor would have to perform the task for which it had been born, hauling the formidable 88 gun through terrain that defied lesser machines. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the sergeant nodded, and the men began their preparations. They worked with deliberate efficiency. Chains were inspected, couplings tightened, and the gun's trail legs secured for transport. The tractor's engine compartment was opened one last time, the mechanic placing a hand on the Maybach block as though confirming the machine's willingness to cooperate. When he closed the panel, his expression held a mixture of doubt and respect. Fuel had been rationed carefully for this single attempt. There would be no second try. The driver settled into the seat, turned the ignition, and listened as the engine caught with a resonant growl that rose from deep within the frame. It was less an idle than a declaration, a locomotive awakening ready to shoulder its burden. The vehicle shuddered as the driver eased the throttle and the long tow chain pulled taut with a metallic snap. The 88 gun lurched forward a few inches, then steadied. The mission had begun. As the convoy moved toward the ascent, mud sucked greedily at the tracks. The incline ahead loomed higher than expected, the ridge crowned with wind-bent trees swaying in the cold. The Sd.Kfz 7 pressed onward, each rotation of its interleaved wheels scattering clumps of wet earth. The driver leaned forward instinctively, as though willing the machine to maintain momentum. Behind him, the gun followed like a reluctant shadow, its weight threatening at every moment to halt the climb. Halfway up, the incline steepened. The tractor slowed, the rumble of its engine deepening into a laboring roar. Exhaust curled into the air, gray and insistent. The men walking alongside placed gloved hands on the gun's shield, pushing in unison to relieve even a fraction of the strain. The mud slick beneath their boots made footing uncertain. Every step carried the possibility of sliding backward, yet the machine in front of them refused to yield. Cold wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it the distant thump of artillery. The battlefield felt suspended as though watching this single ascent with held breath. The Sd.Kfz 7 clawed forward by inches. Its tracks sank, then bit, then surged again. It was a contest between engineering and earth, one built in steel, the other carved by weather, and for a moment it was impossible to know which would prevail. Then slowly the tractor crested the ridge. The men behind it exhaled in relief. The gun rolled onto firmer ground, settling into position with the solemnity of a weapon preparing for its final argument. For the first time, the Sd.Kfz 7 had served not the Wehrmacht, but the army that had captured it. Power, once aligned with one purpose, had been redirected toward another. In that brief triumph, the GIs felt renewed respect for the machine they had doubted and cursed. Its complexity remained, its demands had not lessened, but in this moment its strength had mattered more than its appetite. It had performed a task no American vehicle could match, and done so under conditions that might have defeated it only a day earlier. Yet even as they repositioned the 88 gun and prepared its firing data, the men sensed that this accomplishment carried its own shadow. Fuel had been spent, the engine strained, and the road back down was no easier. And somewhere within the machine's steady ticking as it cooled, another challenge was already gathering in the hours ahead. The climb had barely begun when the familiar anxiety returned. The driver glanced down at the dashboard and saw the fuel needle sliding with unnerving speed toward the lower quarter of the gauge. He blinked, hoping it was an illusion brought on by the incline, but the descent continued, steady, undeniable, and far faster than any calculation had predicted. The tractor was pulling magnificently, but it was burning through its reserves with the same determination. The sergeant riding beside him muttered under his breath, already understanding what this meant. The machine was giving everything it had, and in return it demanded more than they possessed. A forward patrol, positioned farther up the rise, radioed back with unwelcome precision. Through a scratch of static came the verdict: "You won't make the ridge without another can." There was no argument in the man's voice, only the blunt arithmetic of war. The incline was too long, the mud too soft, the load too heavy. Even with the Maybach engine operating at near full effort, the Sd.Kfz 7 was drinking fuel at a rate that bordered on reckless necessity. It was a reminder that power in any form carries consequence. Behind the tractor, a small supply team broke away from the main column and began a hurried return to the rear. They carried empty fuel cans clattering against one another, their urgency a quiet echo of the battle unfolding beyond the ridge. As they descended the slope, shells began to land along the far tree line, enemy artillery probing toward the American position. The supply men did not pause. They drove into the smoke and noise, understanding that if the tractor stalled now, the 88 gun behind it would become little more than immovable cargo. Minutes later, as the Sd.Kfz 7 continued its slow ascent, the supply team reappeared, hauling full cans toward the straining engine. The men moved with the precision of a drill, even under the whip of distant fire. One soldier climbed onto the half-track's running board, hooking his arm through the railing as he unlatched the fuel cap. Another passed up a can, its weight sloshing with the sound of reprieve. They refueled the machine on the slope itself, the tractor still crawling forward, the gun still in tow, as though refusing to halt even for its own sustenance. The men cursed the vehicle freely now. They cursed its size, its hunger, its arrogance in engineering. Yet beneath the frustration ran a thread of admiration that no amount of hardship could erase. The Sd.Kfz 7 did not falter. Its engine did not hesitate. It pulled the gun with a determination that matched the men's own, as if acknowledging the shared burden between steel and soldier. In its grinding ascent, there was something almost human, a steadfast refusal to yield. At last the ridge came into view, the trees thinning as the slope leveled into a narrow crest overlooking the contested road below. The tractor, coated in mud and trembling with exertion, dragged itself onto the plateau. For a moment the engine sputtered, then settled into a deep, exhausted idle. Behind it, the 88 gun rolled to a stop, its barrel pointing toward the horizon where enemy armor might soon appear. The GIs stood quietly, breathing in the cold air, aware they had accomplished something few vehicles in their arsenal could have managed. Only then did the full truth settle in. German heavy weapons had depended utterly on machines like this, not occasionally, not conveniently, but fundamentally. Without tractors capable of such feats, the 88 gun's legendary reputation could never have reached its mythic status. Every decorated battery, every battlefield victory, relied on a chain of logistics anchored by vehicles as demanding as they were capable. The GIs saw now that German firepower had not been born solely of superior guns, but of the engines that pulled them into place. And they saw, too, how fragile that system had become as the war dragged on. When fuel grew scarce, when convoys were cut apart by Allied air power, when the Reich's petroleum reserves dwindled to a shadow of their former promise, machines like the Sd.Kfz 7 became liabilities rather than assets. The weapon remained deadly, but the means to position it collapsed. Power without supply had proven to be no power at all. As the men prepared the ridge for defense and the half-track cooled in the gathering wind, they understood the irony that lingered at the heart of the moment. The stronger the machine, the more costly its loyalty. And ahead of them, the next test of that cost approached with the rumble of distant engines on the far side of the valley. When the smoke cleared from the ridge and the urgency of the mission ebbed, the Sd.Kfz 7 sat cooling in the fading light like an exhausted animal. Officers gathered around it with clipboards and hardened expressions, ready to decide the machine's future. The tractor had performed brilliantly, no one denied that. It had hauled the captured 88 gun into position with a strength unmatched by any American vehicle on the line. But war, especially in its final months, judged equipment not by moments of triumph, but by the sum of its demands. And the demands of this machine were beginning to eclipse its usefulness. The day's consumption log told the story with numbers rather than sentiment. The Sd.Kfz 7 had burned more fuel in a single operation than an M3 half-track consumed in 3 days under similar conditions. The contrast struck the officers with the force of revelation. What the Germans had, built as a symbol of capability, had, in practice, become a symbol of cost. For an army sustained by long chains of supply stretching back across the Atlantic, such extravagance could not be indulged. Even victory required restraint. Maintenance crews added their own observations. They had inspected the suspension, the steering assembly, and the interleaved wheel system whose complexity bordered on the ornate. To keep such a vehicle running would require specialized tools, specialized training, and specialized parts, none of which existed in American depots. The Maybach engine alone demanded attention that outpaced the rhythms of a mobile army. Bolts required metric wrenches, lubricants differed from U.S. standards, and even the tracks displayed a design philosophy that assumed a support network the Americans did not possess. The verdict, written in grease and exhaustion, was clear. The vehicle could be used but not sustained. Late that afternoon, the final order arrived from battalion headquarters. It was phrased without emotion, stripped of any acknowledgement of the machine's achievement. Use it until the next mechanical failure, then abandon. The words fell with the weight of inevitability. The Sd.Kfz, Seven's fate had been decided not by performance, nor by loyalty, nor by admiration, but by arithmetic. It had entered American service as a trophy and momentarily risen to become an asset. Now it would linger only as long as its own momentum carried it, until the next breakdown ended the experiment. The GIs received the decision in silence. Some nodded unsurprised. Others looked at the half-track with a quiet resignation. Their respect for the machine had grown with every mile, every jolt it absorbed, every challenge it overcame. Yet they understood the logic. War did not permit affection for captured steel. Machines were judged by cost, by burden, by the unseen currency of logistics. The Sd.Kfz 7, for all its excellence, was simply too expensive to keep alive. One soldier rested a hand on the cold armor of the engine hood. The metal no longer radiated heat. Its moment of triumph had already faded. Another soldier, remembering the strain of the climb, muttered that the machine belonged to a different war, a war where resources were abundant, where engineering ambitions could stretch without regard for limitations. The comment lingered in the air. In a sense, he was right. The Sd.Kfz 7 had been conceived in an era of confidence, nurtured by a nation that believed quality alone could secure victory. But the world had changed faster than the doctrine that created it. As evening settled across the ridge, the half-track stood motionless, its silhouette dark against the dimming sky. It felt less like a vehicle now and more like an artifact, an object caught between past and present, admired yet impractical, formidable yet unsustainable. The Americans knew it would serve for a little longer, perhaps another day, perhaps only another hour. Then it would stop, quietly and without ceremony. And when it did, they would leave it where it rested, a relic not of defeat, but of a philosophy that no longer matched the realities of war. For now, though, it remained. And in that temporary stillness, the men understood a truth deeper than engineering, that in modern conflict, the lifespan of a machine was determined not by what it could achieve, but by what it required. Ahead, the moment approached when the half-track's requirements would finally eclipse its purpose. And when that moment came, its story would shift from battlefield tool to abandoned monument on a road that no longer needed it. To understand the fate of one captured half-track on a muddy ridge outside Aachen, the narrative must widen, lifting from the immediate scene into the vast machinery of the European war itself. For individual soldiers, the battlefield was measured in hedgerows, crossroads, and ruined farmhouses. But for nations, the battlefield was measured in fuel reserves, shipping routes, and the industrial pulse of entire continents. From that higher vantage, the story of the Sd.Kfz 7 becomes more than a tale of engineering. It becomes a reflection of a strategic truth that shaped the war's outcome long before the first American soldier set foot in Europe. By 1944, Germany's access to fuel had collapsed into fragility. In the early years of the war, the Reich imported millions of tons of oil from Romania, the Soviet Union, and synthetic production plants that turned coal into liquid fuel at staggering cost. But Allied bombing campaigns targeted refineries with growing efficiency, reducing output month by month. The fields of Ploiesti, once the engine of German mobility, produced only a fraction of their former capacity. Pipelines faltered, rail networks strained, and the armored divisions that had raced across Europe now found themselves paralyzed by scarcity. What had been a river became a trickle, barely enough to keep essential units alive, never enough to sustain the vast ambitions of 1941. As Germany's fuel reserves dwindled, its military structure fractured from within. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, watched its fighters grounded not by enemy aircraft but by empty fuel tanks. Pilots stood beside their machines, listening to engines that would not start. Armor battalions counted their operational tanks and found only a handful capable of moving. Even the mighty Tiger and Panther, symbols of German military prowess, sat motionless in the fields, their power useless without the petroleum that should have fed them. Artillery tractors like the Sd.Kfz 7 became statues along the roadside, abandoned not from mechanical failure but from the impossibility of sustaining their appetite. The contrast with the Allied system could not have been sharper. American supply chains stretched with geometric clarity from factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, through ports on the East Coast, across the Atlantic in convoys protected by destroyers, and finally to the depots and distribution hubs that fed the front. It was a network that functioned not on improvisation, but on calculation. Logistics officers tracked tonnage, fuel allocation, spare parts, and rations with the precision of accountants, knowing that an army's strength flowed from its ability to move. Each division received what it required not by miracle but by design. The result was visible on every road the Americans traveled. Columns of trucks moved in disciplined sequence, their routes mapped and timed so that ammunition, food, and fuel arrived with predictability. The M3 half-track, the Jeep, the Sherman tank, each machine had been conceived with this system in mind. Standardized parts, interchangeable components, and familiar engines allowed mechanics to keep vehicles operating miles from the nearest depot. The American arsenal was not the most refined nor the most powerful, but it rarely stopped. Momentum, once generated, was not easily lost. On this grand scale, the Sd.Kfz 7 emerges as more than a piece of captured equipment. It becomes a symbol of Germany's strategic mistake, a belief that technical brilliance could offset economic limits. In its craftsmanship lay undeniable achievement, smooth suspension, powerful towing capacity, and engineering finesse that impressed even its enemies. But the machine existed within a doctrine that underestimated the cost of sustaining excellence. The Germans built marvels. They did not build enough fuel to feed them. Meanwhile, the M3 half-track represented the American truth. Reliability wins wars. It lacked elegance, but it consumed far less, required fewer repairs, and could be replaced quickly. Thousands rolled out of factories each month, each one reinforcing a system designed for longevity rather than spectacle. The M3 did not inspire awe in the same way the Sd.Kfz 7 did, but awe does not push armies across continents. Consistency does. By widening the lens, the story of one half-track becomes a lesson in the deeper currents of the conflict. Germany, with its intricate machines and dwindling resources, waged war on borrowed time. The United States, with its standardized vehicles and vast industrial output, waged war within the limits it had already calculated and prepared to exceed. The difference determined more battlefields than any single maneuver or victory. And as the Sd.Kfz 7 waited on the ridge for its next assignment or its final breakdown, it stood as a monument to a larger truth. That strategy is not written solely in steel, but in fuel, labor, and the invisible arteries of supply. A truth that would reveal itself even more sharply in the days ahead, as the captured machine approached the end of its short American service. The end came without drama, as such endings often do. The captured Sd.Kfz 7 was moving along a cold, gray stretch of road east of the Ruhr when the first signs announced themselves, small at first, subtle enough that only the driver sensed something amiss. The engine's once confident rhythm carried a faint irregularity, a thinning of power that felt more like fatigue than failure. He opened the throttle gently, but the response was muted, as though the machine were exhaling rather than accelerating. Moments later came a sharp metallic crack, followed by a lurch that pulled the tractor violently to one side. The driver braked, and the half-track settled into the mud with a heavy resignation. When the men climbed down to inspect the damage, the truth was immediately visible. One of the track guides had sheared itself apart, sending a section of the track into misalignment. The steel links that had carried them across hills and through mud now rested twisted and useless against the frozen ground. Closer inspection revealed another wound. The Maybach engine, long strained beyond the expectations of its design, showed declining compression in 2 cylinders. It had given everything it could, and the price of that effort had finally come due. The sergeant knelt beside the broken guide, running a gloved hand along the jagged edge of the fracture. "That's it," he said quietly. There was no anger in the words, only acknowledgement. The officers had been clear: use the machine until its next mechanical failure. And here, on a road leading toward the collapsing industrial heart of Germany, the Sd.Kfz 7 had reached the limit of its borrowed life. The GIs began to salvage what they could. Tools scraped against metal as they removed radios, ammunition racks, wrenches, and spare equipment. The batteries were carried off first. The Americans always needed batteries. Even the seats, worn smooth by German crews long gone, were unbolted and loaded onto a truck. The process was not rushed, but neither was it sentimental. War had taught the men to take what was useful and leave the rest without hesitation. Machines were companions only until they ceased to serve. Afterward, they became scrap. When the last salvageable parts were removed, the demolition team stepped forward with thermite charges. The charges themselves were small, unremarkable cylinders of powder and metal, silent until ignited, then capable of eating through armor with a heat no water could quench. One soldier paused at the rear of the tractor, taking a final look at the vehicle that had carried them farther than they expected. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. The charges were placed with careful precision along the engine block, transmission housing, and remaining track components. When the fuses were lit, the men stepped back, forming a loose semicircle that felt less like an audience and more like a farewell conducted without ceremony. The thermite erupted into a white-hot glare, sparks cascading like molten grain as the compound burned through steel. The engine sagged inward, its structure collapsing in on itself under the assault. Flames crawled along the vehicle's length, blackening paint and warping plates that had once gleamed under German sun and American rain. When the fire subsided, the Sd.Kfz 7 remained, but only as a skeleton of warped metal. Its identity had dissolved into rust-colored ash and twisted framework. What had once symbolized power, ambition, and engineering mastery was now indistinguishable from the wrecks that lined the roads of a collapsing Reich. The Americans turned away without ceremony, their boots crunching on gravel as they prepared to move on to the next objective. The war demanded constant forward motion. No single machine, no matter how impressive, could command their attention for long. As they departed, the half-track's final moments seemed to echo a wider truth unfolding across Germany. Everywhere, the engines that had driven the Wehrmacht's early victories were failing. Tanks lay abandoned in forests, aircraft rusted on airfields without fuel to lift them, and artillery pieces remained motionless where their tractors had stalled and died. The machinery of the German war effort, once admired for its precision and might, now collapsed under the weight of shortages and exhaustion. The end of the Sd.Kfz 7 was not unique, it was emblematic. What had burned in the thermite's glare was not merely a vehicle. It was a fragment of a doctrine that believed strength lay in excellence alone. But excellence, without sustainability, becomes fragility, and fragility has no place in a war decided by endurance. Ahead, the Americans pressed on toward the Ruhr, leaving behind only cooling steel and the faint trace of smoke rising into a sky that had already forgotten the machine's name. In the years after the war, when veterans gathered in quiet halls or sat on porches shaded by afternoon light, the story of the captured Sd.Kfz 7 would sometimes surface, never as the centerpiece of memory, but as an episode that lingered with unusual clarity. They spoke of it with a mixture of humor and awe, the kind reserved for things encountered only once yet remembered for a lifetime. Laughter rose when someone recalled how quickly the fuel needle dropped, or how the engine roared like a freight train even at idle. But beneath the humor lay a tone of respect, a recognition that the machine had shown them something they had never fully understood before encountering it. They remembered its strength first. Even decades later, the memory of that immense torque, felt through the steering column, the frame, the low thunder of the Maybach engine, remained vivid. They recalled how it climbed the muddy ridge outside Aachen when every American half-track had failed the attempt. They acknowledged that no M3 in their battalion could have hauled an 88 gun under those conditions. The Germans, they admitted, had built a machine of extraordinary capability. It could have pulled a barn off its foundation, one veteran remarked during an interview, a line that others nodded at with a smile. The power was undeniable. But so was the cost, and that was the part no GI ever forgot, they remember. At the endless supply runs, the way fuel poured into the tank as though vanishing into a bottomless chamber. They remembered calculating range with the tension usually reserved for ammunition counts. More than one veteran expressed astonishment that German units had ever kept such machines operating across thousands of miles of Eastern Front mud or North African desert. Looking back, they understood that these vehicles had not been abandoned lightly. They had been abandoned because sustaining them became impossible. In this way, the Sd.Kfz 7 taught them a lesson they would only fully appreciate years later, that engineering excellence, when unbound by practical limits, can mislead a nation into believing that performance is more important than supply. The Americans saw in the half-track a reflection of the broader German mindset, a belief that precision and craftsmanship could compensate for shortages, overextension, and the industrial imbalance that increasingly shaped the war. The Sd.Kfz 7 embodied this belief with clarity. It was magnificent to operate, formidable in purpose, but costly in every measure that mattered once the conflict turned into a contest of endurance. Veterans spoke often of how this single vehicle revealed something larger about Germany's wartime trajectory. The Reich had advanced with breathtaking brilliance in the early years, swift armored thrusts, airborne assaults, and the ruthless synchronization of combined arms. But brilliance is not the same as sustainability. When the war stretched into its third and fourth years, the foundations beneath those achievements began to crack. Fuel shortages, over-engineered equipment, and logistical strain became the invisible adversaries the Wehrmacht could not defeat.